Well, thanks everyone again for joining us this evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, as well as our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're very excited to welcome Michel in conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman. For years, one country has acted as the greatest offshore haven in the world, attracting hundreds of billions of dollars in illicit finance tied directly to corrupt regimes, extremist networks, and the worst the world has to offer. But it hasn't been the sand-splattered Caribbean islands or even traditional financial secrecy havens like Switzerland or Panama that have come to dominate the offshoring world. Instead, the country profiting the most also happens to be the one that still claims to be the moral leader of the free world, the USA. Fiona Hill of the Brookings Institution calls American Kleptocracy clearly written, compelling, and fast-paced. A clarion call for citizens and those at all levels of government who have not yet realized that we need to clean up our own act to protect ourselves from predatory adversaries. Michel's writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New Republic, and Politico magazine, among others. He's joining us tonight from his childhood home right here in Portland, Oregon. Michel will be joined in conversation by Alexander Vindman, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel who is most recently the Director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the White House's National Security Council. Previously, he served as the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as an attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Russia. He's also the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Here, Right Matters, An American Story, which came out earlier this year. We thank him for joining us. He's joining us from Prague, Oklahoma. This evening's event includes an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question at any time. And if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, you can upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please support Casey and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy American Kleptocracy, as well as a link to buy Alex's book, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Casey, Alex, we're thrilled to welcome you both this evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kevin and Jeremy behind the scenes there helping set this up. Thank you, Powell's Books, and of course, Michel, thank you for writing this book and for inviting me to moderate this conversation. So, American Kleptocracy, how the US created the world's greatest money laundering scheme in history. Why did you write this book?
Well, thanks so much, Alex.
One alibi.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin, I'm in Prague, Oklahoma. It's spelled like Prague, but it's in Prague.
I thought you said it was Prague.
It is. It's spelled like that. It's pronounced Prague because we're in Oklahoma.
I do want to shout out Donna Vandiver, my 8th grade teacher, who I saw is in the chat, coming to us today from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we have a good Oklahoma contingent here with us today. Alex, obviously, that's kind of the key question behind the entire book. I'll answer that in a moment. Obviously, thank you to Powell's. Thank you to Kevin and to Jeremy. As a native, born and raised Portlander, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be coming to you today, speaking at an event at Powell's. I'm still in a little bit of disbelief about that. I am coming from my childhood bedroom, so apologies about the Batman poster behind me. I swear there is other kleptocracy and money laundering related material in the room as well. And then needless to say, Alex, I am deeply grateful that you are here with us today, both as a fellow author, as a fellow a figure who's following developments in the post-Soviet space, although not nearly to the extent and with the position that you have, as well as a fellow American. I am just deeply grateful that you are here and that you have continued to play a role in this broader awareness of, swelling awareness of national security threats, broader threats to democracy writ large, both domestic and international, that these oligarchic, kleptocratic, authoritarian figures pose. So the title of the book is called, and I do have a copy here, American Kleptocracy, how the U.S. created the world's greatest money laundering scheme in history. And I suppose that's maybe a little bit of a mouthful of a title. It has a word in it that I think a lot of folks may not be familiar with, and that is kleptocracy itself. Kleptocracy, the root of the term, literally means rule of thieves. Klepto, thief, kleptocracy, rule of thieves. And in many ways, when we're talking about kleptocracy, you can certainly still use that term to describe governments and regimes around the world that are not democratic, that are not dedicated to any greater public good, greater public service, but that are dedicated only to stealing from the people that they oversee, that are using their positions in power to loot national coffers, to steal from education budgets, from infrastructure budgets, from health budgets, to use their positions to gain access to the economic crown jewels of a country. These are natural gas wells, these are oil wells or mining concerns that they then use and exploit only for their benefit, not for the benefit of the people. And when we're talking about that kind of kleptocracy, I think we can talk about modern Russia under Putin, which has been transformed into what was a fledgling transitioning democracy in the 1990s. We're coming up next month on the 30th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And really within the first decade or so, we saw elements of democratic transition. And then Putin came to power in 2000. And what we have seen since is the degradation of democracy in Russia and the rise of this oligarchic, kleptocratic class with Putin right at the top. And what we've seen time and again is those figures who are close to Putin, those figures who are the oligarchs who have risen with him, are dedicated or seem to be dedicated only to pillaging Russians, pillaging the Russian populace, and looting effectively the Russian economy. Now, this is a development we've seen across many different countries in that region, and there are many different kleptocratic regimes that have risen as a result. But what I'm writing about, and certainly what I argue in the book, is that that's fine to use kleptocracy as that, but what I want to kind of expand is the notion of kleptocracy as something that's limited only to one country. What I'm writing about is an international financial architecture that incentivizes not only those kleptocratic regimes themselves, but that then takes much of that money that those figures, those oligarchs, those authoritarians, those dictators, takes much of their money and moves it out of those countries. So in this case, moves it out of Russia or out of Kazakhstan or out of China, and moves it into other countries, other jurisdictions, other places. That money can be hidden, it can be kept safe, it can still be controlled, but it can never be tracked back to the oligarchs, the authoritarians, the dictators that are looting their people. This is really what I argue kleptocracy is in a nutshell: an international financial architecture that sees the movements of hundreds of billions, or in some cases, some estimates now, trillions of dollars from developing countries, from fledgling democracies or rising authoritarian regimes, and moves that money very often into the West, and as we now know, right into the United States of America itself. And this is a transition, a transformation that is relatively recent, certainly relatively recent in terms of anybody really paying any attention to it, but it has been moving in this direction for the last 2 or 3 decades. And it takes a few different tools. It takes shell companies, anonymous real estate purchases, anonymous luxury goods purchases. We can talk a little bit more about that. But when I'm talking about kleptocracy, and certainly what you'll see in the book, and I do hope you purchase a copy. My publisher will be so happy. And please purchase a copy of Alex's book too. I read it recently. It is absolutely fantastic. What I'm talking about is this international financial architecture that sees the outflow of billions and billions and potentially trillions of dollars from these developing countries into the West, into the United States, and no journalists, no authorities, no investigators can track it or and can trace it. But those oligarchs, those kleptocrats, can still use that money for whatever they need. They can keep it safe. They can spend it on disinformation campaigns or anti-democratic campaigns. They can spend it on militias. They can spend it on whatever they need to in order to not only remain in power in their countries, but then begin assaulting and degrading democracy right here in the United States of America. So that's what I argue kleptocracy is in the 21st century.
So there's, when you early in the book, you kind of do kleptocracy and money laundering by the numbers.
Yeah.
Could you talk about scale of money laundering and give a particularly egregious example of kleptocracy and money laundering through the U.S.?
Yeah, so this is, as Alex mentioned, right, the very first page, there's a lovely index that we have right here, just some of the key figures. I do have one of my editors, Prannoy Sarkar, to thank for this idea. I wish I could claim this was my own idea. But when we're talking about scale, right, because it's easy to talk about, okay, there are shell companies in Delaware, and okay, there are anonymous real estate purchases in California, and okay, there's anonymous private equity investments in Connecticut. And those all kind of exist in their own little sphere. But when we're talking about this scale of kleptocracy, which in many ways is the same kind of scale of things like offshoring as it has been traditionally understood, again, we're talking about staggering amounts of money, money that is in many ways too big to see. So I'll just read some of these right here. The estimated amount of private wealth located in global financial secrecy jurisdictions. Again, this is global, not just the U.S., although the U.S. is a significant part of this. The total estimated amount, 24 to 32 trillion dollars. That's about 10% of global wealth is now in this offshoring financial secrecy invisible world. And for scale, that's a little bit bigger than the Chinese GDP. So if we're thinking about kleptocracy and offshoring, it's almost this kind of invisible superpower that has just been developing with so few of us paying any attention to it. Or, here's another thing that I think really gets home of what the scale of this is. So the amount of money that developing countries have lost in unrecorded capital flight. So again, anonymous, off the books money, the amount of money that they have lost since 1980, $16.3 trillion. So again, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And for scale, that's 3 times the amount of money that has been given to those countries in foreign aid. So if you want to look at it a different way, for every dollar that Western countries or developed countries give to developing countries, for every dollar that they give, $3 is taken out, just disappears from those developing countries. And it very often disappears right into the United States of America. And again, it goes into a number of specific industries. It uses a number of specific anonymous tools that can never be tracked or traced back to those oligarchs, those rights abusers, those environmental destroyers, all those who have any kind of dirty money burning holes in their pockets. That's the scale that we're talking about. It is gargantuan, and it's only getting bigger each and every year. The more we learn about it, the more analysis is done, and certainly the more books like this and others examine the phenomenon. Every time a new material is published on this, the number gets bigger and bigger.
So what about an example, kind of like, illustrate one of these oligarch laundering enterprises,
Yeah.
and how they, where the stolen funds maybe originate from A to Z. Like, give us one story.
Yeah, so the book itself, it has all kinds of policy discussions. It has all kind of details about how certain decisions were taken in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere that allowed these networks to come into the U.S. and created, as we call it, this so-called race to the bottom in terms of providing all the anonymous financial secrecy tools that these figures need. But that's all in the book. But the book does have a narrative component as well. It can be a relatively depressing topic to write about international money laundering and oligarchs and autocrats. I tried to have some fun stories in there if I could. One case study in the book, it examines a gentleman who is the son of the longest standing dictator in the world. His father rules over a small African country called Equatorial Guinea, which is located in Central Africa, oil-rich country. His father's been in power for 40 years. They have more money than they know what to do with, none of which trickles down to the people at all. It all goes to this family and to their inner circles. That, again, allows them to continue this longest-standing dictatorship in the world. But the son wants more than anything. He wants to be a celebrity. He wants to be seen as this incredible mogul, as I describe him, this Jay-Z of Africa type. And what he does is he comes to the United States of America, and he and his family spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars moving it into the U.S. using these anonymous financial secrecy tools. Again, this is money that should have gone to the people of Equatorial Guinea that have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country, in the world, highest poverty rates in the world, highest maternal mortality rates in the world. They are absolutely suffering. And this ruling family is taking all the money that should have gone to them and instead, in many ways, moving it right here into the United States of America. And what the son ends up doing, and he's the main case study that I write about from this family, he buys this incredible $30 million mansion down in Malibu. He buys 32 different high-end Lamborghinis and Maseratis and Bugattis and all these cars that I will certainly never afford. Hopefully I'll get a test drive in them at one point. He ends up becoming, he goes to all these art and auction houses, and he ends up becoming the world's biggest collector of Michael Jackson memorabilia. I mean, these are the kind of things that he's pouring all of this dirty, illicit money into. This is how he's transforming, how he's laundering all of that money that he should never have had access to in the first place into, in the eyes of the law, perfectly legitimate, perfectly legal assets. He's got the mansion, he's got the cars, he has a private jet at one point, he has designs on building a 200-foot yacht, and he's got Michael Jackson's crystal-studded glove. I won't spoil what happens to him in the book. That's not the end of his story. I will say that unfortunately the crystal-studded glove is now in Equatorial Guinea, so I haven't been able to see it in person. I don't know who among the listeners is planning to go to Equatorial Guinea next. If you do, please keep an eye out for the crystal glove there. No, but I will say that is a fun story. Fun in the sense that it's flash and substance, but there are darker elements to this. And this is, Alex, this is kind of where I wanted to bring this more into a conversation rather than a Q&A, because we are talking about figures, people, oligarchs that are dedicated, again, not to democracy, not to public good, not to public service, not to representing constituents, but that are dedicated, certainly domestically, to holding on to power regardless of the costs, and then doing what they can elsewhere, doing what they can to stave off investigations, doing what they can to influence policy in places like Washington, places like London, places like Brussels. You know, one of the really interesting case studies in putting this book together was looking especially at Ukraine. You know, Ukraine has had this incredible 30-year history following the end of the Soviet Union. We, I think, have a general familiarity with what Ukraine's been dealing with following the Russian invasion in 2014. I was wondering, Alex, given your deep experience and expertise in Ukraine and in the region, can you talk just a little bit about what you have seen in your experience about how these international money laundering networks, especially from the oligarchs, how has that intersected with democracy or democratic transition? Because again, we're talking now almost 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, coming next month. We have an excellent kind of vantage point now. What's your takeaway from the role that these international money laundering networks, kleptocracy, has played, especially in things like Ukraine and its democratic trajectory?
Sure. So actually, I wrote an article about this back in June or July. I think it was June. And it was basically the notion of weaponized corruption. Corruption as a tool of statecraft. Another good name for it could be strategic corruption. So the idea of basically using this enormous amount of wealth domestically to retain control of security, of defense enterprises, to act outside of legal frameworks, and at the same time, so that's internal, maintaining power, and at the same time, buy access and freedom of maneuver overseas. And we see that play out in both the UK and the US in a great deal. Frankly, the US is such a massive economy that it probably does have an effect, but it's like, it's more localized in pinpricks or so. It's the Kolomoisky networks operating in like the Midwest and Ohio or something of that nature, currying favor, both laundering the capital, storing the capital, and buying some local influence. But in the UK, it's really kind of, it's huge investments in real estate. It's the acquisition of assets and legitimacy, and then using the UK legal system to shut down opposition or shut down critical voices based on their libel and slander laws, where it's quite easy to one of our colleagues, Catherine Belton, suffered this quite recently for a book that she wrote. So it's the use of this wealth to buy access and legitimacy that advances individuals' aims. That's problematic, but sometimes more importantly, it advances state aims. In the case of Russia, it's a nearly seamless access to oligarchs and oligarchs' wealth to achieve national security objectives. And that to me is particularly troubling. I talked about certain areas, but another particularly pernicious one is the purchase and investment in parties, in political parties, to influence politicians that create the laws, or that potentially fringe right-wing parties in France, in Hungary, in Czechia, and so forth, to influence policy. So it's pretty troubling development, and they're not the only ones to do it. The Chinese are doing it. Other countries are doing it. The Russians are kind of pioneers and particularly adept at it. But tell me a little bit about what you've experienced.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the points that you just made, Alex, which is one of the things I do want to home in on, is I wrote this book. I'm sure my accent gives it away, as an American. Again, born and raised here in Portland. I wrote it especially for American audiences. Again, I'm arguing that the U.S. is now the biggest financial secrecy, offshoring, pro-kleptocracy haven in the world, and it does that through a series of jurisdictions and decisions. We're talking about anonymous shell companies in places like Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, anonymous trusts in places like South Dakota, as well as loopholes that allow for large-scale illicit money laundering movement into real estate, private equity, hedge funds, art and auction houses, and luxury goods, in addition to a number of other industries. This is kind of how it works, right? This is kleptocracy 101. You have the money, you want to strip it of anybody being able to identify you controlling that money. You do that by using shell companies, you do that by using anonymous trusts, and then beyond that, you park that money out of the original country. You park that, in this case, in the United States, in places like New York, in places like Miami, in places like Los Angeles, in the penthouses or the condos or the private jets, or again, the Michael Jackson memorabilia, or whatever celebrity memorabilia you'd like. One of the names that you just mentioned, though, Alex, was a gentleman named Kolomoisky. Igor Kolomoisky is his name. And he's a Ukrainian oligarch. He's now been sanctioned or banned from the U.S. for his large-scale corruption. And there's all kinds of questions about how he made his money and the kind of political role that he plays in Ukraine. Again, Ukraine being a very key component of America's broader national security picture. But he's one of the main case studies in the book itself as well. I know I just shared the story about the guy going to Malibu with Michael Jackson. He's got the flash, hanging out with the Michael Jackson family and all the other celebrities. And that's fine. But this Kolomoisky guy is kind of the other side of this coin. Because when we're talking about international money laundering and kleptocracy, it's no longer just Miami and Manhattan and Malibu. What we know from filings with the Department of Justice, what we know from investigations in Ukraine itself, what we know from ongoing prosecution is that Kolomoisky, he was effectively running a gigantic Ponzi scheme in Ukraine, overseeing a bank that Ukrainian depositors lost billions of dollars in. He effectively stole billions of dollars from Ukrainian depositors, but he didn't move it into Miami. He didn't move it into Manhattan. He didn't move it into London or Paris. He moved it into the American Midwest. He moved it into the American heartland. Because again, we're talking about, in this case, real estate. There's no anti-money laundering checks. Anybody can buy any amount of real estate, regardless of the source of their money. They can be any oligarch or dictator, and they can buy as much American real estate as they want. And what Kolomoisky realized, nobody's paying attention to the American heartland. Nobody's paying attention to the Midwest, to the Rust Belt. He ended up becoming the biggest commercial landlord in Cleveland, Ohio. He ended up dominating small towns, steel towns, factory towns in Illinois and West Virginia and Kentucky. I don't think he actually went to Oklahoma. I think, thankfully, Oklahoma dodged a bullet there. But what we know is
money coming into Oklahoma.
Well, this is the kind of kleptocratic canary in the coal mine, if I get all my alliteration right, is that this is only one case study, because what ended up happening is that he didn't come into these places looking to make money. He didn't come into these places looking to create jobs or revitalize the local economy. He just wanted a place to hide the money away from Ukrainian authorities and where no one else was looking. And what we know happened since is that these steel mills, these commercial real estate buildings, these factories, they've all begun falling apart. They've all effectively gone to rot. No jobs came back. There's no revitalization. And now the buildings are nearing a state of implosion because there's no new investment. All the Kolomoisky network wanted, allegedly, was to keep their money safe. And that dries up local economies, that desiccates and destroys local economic opportunities. And then we have that kind of broader intersection with kleptocracy and the decline of kind of blue-collar jobs in America. So this is one of the things that hopefully is kind of one of the takeaways of the book, is that when we're talking about all this international money laundering, it's not just the celebrities and the jet set lifestyle and the kind of the, you know, the lifestyles of the global 1%. It's now affecting Main Street America. It's now affecting small town America. And this is where we had the intersection with the decline of certain sectors of the American economy. And then what effect does that have on American politics moving forward? You know, economic populism, you name it. We're only just beginning to learn about that. I was wondering, though, Alex, to turn it back to you again for a second, because given, you know, one of the terms that you just brought up was strategic or weaponized corruption, which is really this kind of term of art that we've only begun seeing in the last year or two. Because I know I just talked about the economic underpinnings and the economic degradation, but there's still a political component to this. I was wondering if you could talk just a moment about how these elements of strategic corruption, you know, how do they work? What are they aiming for, I guess? What is the point of these kleptocratic figures in, for instance, Russia, using these anonymous shell company or trust, other money laundering services? How does that become strategic corruption? What are they trying to achieve ultimately by using American financial secrecy for their own ends?
Well, I think there's, for instance, in Russia, there were a couple of objectives. Part of this enterprise started to unfold to coincide with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the KGB was looking at for ways to secure a war chest for whatever might come, whether that's basically security for the KGB officers or continued KGB operations, not understanding, you know, where basically the slow moving but foreseeable collapse of the Soviet Union might end up. So what you see is the KGB offshoring large accounts, KGB accounts, and protecting those. I think that was probably initially intended just to protect those resources from unforeseen circumstances. So if the Soviet Union collapses, then somebody could go ahead and appropriate those resources if they were based in Russia, and you know, so the KGB was looking to protect it. But I think eventually there was a recognition that, first of all, there was a lot of you're not just protecting your funds, but you're growing your portfolio, and you're basically also providing the resources to conduct operations overseas. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where this, over the course of 30 years, you know, we see an evolution to the complexities that we see now. So it's protecting. A lot of folks want to put their money not in Russia specifically because they don't want the Kremlin to have access to it. That's part of the story, frankly. When you don't have rule of law, you don't have security for your property. There's no respect for property rights. You want to go ahead and park your money somewhere else. So there's a very, very practical issue here for a lot of oligarchs. But then there's also the question of ill-gotten gains, not paying taxes, and then the state saying, look, you're still living in this country. You could either go ahead and let us have access to some subset of this, whether it's in Switzerland, the US, or the UK, and we'll conduct these operations, you know, funding private military corporations out of, you know, secret accounts or any number of different nefarious activities. And I think part of this is also Russia's way of competing asymmetrically. Yeah. So they have a you know, fraction of US wealth. Their economy is somewhere around $1.8 trillion. It's a tenth of the US economy. Yeah. It's half the size of California's economy. And one of the ways that they seek to compete more effectively is through strategic corruption, through weaponized corruption to buy the things that they can't achieve through, you know, let's say more crafty uses of capital. So that's part of the story, I think, of places that are, you know, that are looking to do what they can with the resources that they have, yeah, and the U.S. being open to these kinds of transactions. Yeah, and I'd be, you know, next place I'd like to go, because I know we're running low on time, is basically what can we do about this, and yeah, you know, what can we do from the standpoint of we already see some legislation actually going into force. These are good developments, but what more can we do and to stem the flow of kleptocrats resource going into the U.S.?
Yeah, right. And in many ways, that is kind of the $1 trillion question. I mean, what happens next? Where do we go from here? I wanted to say, Alex, one of the comments that you made, which I know we've been talking about Russia and Ukraine plenty in this conversation, but this is a dynamic we see around the world. This international financial architecture incentivizes all these regimes in places like Venezuela or places like Angola or places like Malaysia. I mean, they're all using similar, if not the same, financial secrecy networks using the U.S. for their own ends. And one of the things that you mentioned, Alex, was the lack of rule of law in these kind of source countries. What they are doing is coming to the U.S. because there is the rule of law. There are these legal protections, and it's the kind of subversion of and manipulation of those ends that really is kind of the basic building block of kleptocracy, using the U.S. systems against the U.S. itself and against American democracy itself. Question is, what comes next and what can we do about it? On the very first day of this year, and it's been a rocky few years. This year's been rocky as well. But on January 1st of 2021, the U.S. Congress passed the greatest single piece of anti-money laundering, anti-kleptocracy legislation it has passed in 20 years and potentially ever if we continue and get the language right. What the U.S. Congress did was ban the formation of anonymous shell companies right here in the U.S. So because of this legislation, the U.S. can no longer, in states like Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, that have been creating just thousands and thousands, in some cases millions, of shell companies. Delaware now has more companies than it does people, which makes their constituents, in a very real sense, the companies rather than the people of Delaware. But no longer, the U.S. can no longer do that because of new legislation in Congress. And this was a huge, huge, huge step forward, long overdue. But it is difficult to overstate how important this was to begin cleaning up this mess that we have created. Right? This wasn't a foreign power or foreign oligarchs or foreign kleptocrats imposing these pro-kleptocracy services and industries in the U.S. These were Americans who created these systems, took advantage of these systems, and then made a profit from these systems. We have the banning of anonymous shell companies. That's huge. What we now have in Congress is it's called the Counter Kleptocracy Caucus, which is kind of a mouthful, and I should probably have a drink of water here at some point to make sure I get that accurately. That has been, it's brand new. We've never seen anything like it in the U.S. or elsewhere. It's only a few months old. It's a bipartisan congressional body that has been launching bill after bill after bill to begin patching up America's anti-kleptocracy, anti-money laundering regime. The biggest one that they introduced just a few weeks ago, it's called the Enablers Act. And I've said this before in other talks, other conversations. Enablers in this bill, it's an acronym. And I cannot ever remember what it stands for. And I keep saying I'll be able to memorize it, but I won't. But it stands for Enablers Act. And the enablers are actually one thing we haven't talked about yet, Alex, just as a kind of elevator pitch. You know, I mentioned the shell companies, I mentioned the industries, real estate, private equity, but it takes Americans to make sure that all this money finds the right home. It takes Americans that don't have any kind of anti-money laundering regulations or requirements because of loopholes, because of exemptions. Ironically enough, the American banking sector is far and away the cleanest element of America's financial system because of legislation 20 years ago that cleaned up the American banking sector. But American real estate, private equity, luxury goods, and especially lawyers and law firms. And I'm not talking about them representing clients in court. Everybody should be obviously equal representation under the law. But American law firms can now set up the shell companies, can now set up the anonymous, illicit, wealth-backed real estate purchases. They can lead the lobbying campaigns for these kleptocrats to transform them from kleptocrats into philanthropists and moguls. And they are the ones that also, by the way, intimidate investigative journalists who are trying to investigate these networks. I mean, American law firms, because there's no anti-money laundering requirements whatsoever, they become this really one-stop shop kind of go-to servicing for any kind of kleptocratic need. Any oligarch, any authoritarian can go to an American law firm and get whatever they want with no questions asked. But this bill that was introduced just a couple weeks ago, that will end that. That will implement basic due diligence requirements. If you might potentially be handling and laundering dirty money, you should ask where that money came from. And if it is suspect, you need to alert the US government that that is potentially suspect. We're not saying you don't have to use that money. You don't have to work with that client. But you need to ask questions about where the source of that funds actually is, and is that actually dirty money in itself. So that bill, again, hasn't passed, but it has been introduced. And the last note I wanted to end on, I know we have a couple moments before Q&A, Alex, but this has been, I don't need to explain to you, Alex, the kind of partisan rancor that the U.S. has experienced over the last few years and the fracturing of the kind of broader American body politic. But I will say that one of the saving graces or breaths of fresh air in the American political system is that there really is bipartisan support in Congress for these bills. This caucus that I just mentioned is equal parts Republican and Democrat. Now, Donald Trump is his own figure and his own force, and certainly, as I argue in the book, because of his role in luxury real estate and all the kleptocrats we know that bought Trump properties, has profited handsomely from these developments. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if we want. But in terms of bipartisanship and remaining bipartisanship in Washington, this space really continues to bring together folk from all across the political aisle to begin cleaning up this mess that we have made right at home. Because that really is the first step. Before we can take care of anything else, it comes down to cleaning this up right at home. We know it needs to be done. We now have this caucus. We have other voices that are pushing for this. We know how to get there. And we're finally beginning to see the kind of political will required for that. I end the book relatively optimistically. Alex, is that optimism misplaced? I don't know. We've had a rough few years. I'm sure we're going to have a rough few years yet. Do you sense any of that? Are there elements of optimism, or is it just, have I had too much coffee?
No, I mean, the facetious answer for me would be it depends on the day you ask me. But in reality, the book I wrote, as you know, is really kind of positive in terms of my view of how this country is different, how America's people are different, and how we, sometimes through crisis, and Churchill said, we'll do the right thing after we've tried everything else. So we're likely to make many missteps before we settle on the right thing to do. But I think we will get there. It's just hard to see that path right now, as the last 5 years and probably the next 5 years are going to be enormously challenging. But we've had very challenging periods in our history too. The bulk of the 19th century, the bulk of the 20th century, but we've made steady progress in the right direction. I think the bottom line is, the title of my book is Here Right Matters, but I also now I talk about making it matter, meaning that we need to be engaged and we need to be proactive in making sure that these things actually we don't suborn abuses and so forth.
One of the themes that I really pulled from your book, Alex, I know you emphasized it, but it's really stuck with me, and it works both on an individual as well as a national level, is this idea of recreation and starting over and starting anew. There's no one saying that you have to, if you create yourself, if you identify yourself, if you build a life for yourself or a career for yourself, that you have to remain in that box with that level of expertise or on that trajectory. And certainly that applies to, God knows, both of us personally. That also applies nationally, and especially to the U.S., right? And this is, I think, what you just mentioned. The U.S. has been through so much, but it has this incredible capacity for reinvention and understanding the errors of previous ways, the faults of previous generations or previous policies, and being able to identify ways out and then to create a new framework and a new infrastructure and a new reality beyond that. And I mean, I'll speak frankly, maybe this is American hubris, but this is a global phenomenon that we're not going to fix without American leadership and America working with allies in order to get us there. And the American example of what that is going to take, and frankly, some humility as well, recognition that much of this was created domestically here by Americans, and it will require Americans to get us out of it. So anyways, that's my little soapbox.
I think that's right. I think we're at a tipping point where we're at this era. We're at the end of doing everything wrong, and now we have to hit on doing the right thing. And I think really fundamentally, we just need to retool for the 21st century. Our laws haven't kept pace with the 21st century. Our workforce, our education, our social services, so many things haven't kept pace with where this country's headed. And that's probably one of the reasons that we are dealing with a population that has these deep grievances and is willing to kind of burn the house down just to get their voices heard. But that's an aside. I think we have some excellent questions here. So I'm going to turn to some questions. And I think Anthony Stocks asks a question about following the money. Can you talk about how you track some of these transactions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. I will say, so there's two main case studies in the book itself. One, the Michael Jackson gentleman, his name is Teodor Obiang from Equatorial Guinea. And then the other, the Ukrainian gentleman, the Ukrainian oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky. The reason that I chose both, well, there's a number of reasons I chose both of them, but the reasons that I did go with both of them is because we already have incredibly detailed information about how these networks either work or were at least alleged to work. So on the one hand, Obiang has been the subject of multiple high-profile investigations, prosecutions, and then eventually the actual seizure of his assets by the Department of Justice. So he no longer has, I guess this is spoiling a little bit, but he no longer has the mansion in Malibu. I won't tell you what he was able to keep and actually steal from the American government, but he doesn't have as much as he once had. But what we have seen is high-profile congressional hearings and investigations into how his network operated, into the banks he was using, the American lawyers he was using, the American real estate agents he was using, the American auction house and art houses he was using, the American, escrow agencies, all these different American nationals, all these different American industries we know about because of, frankly, incredible work from legislators in Congress. If there is one hero in the book, and Alex, I don't know if you ever had a chance to meet him, was Carl Levin, who was this longstanding senator from the state of Michigan, who in the 1990s and the 2000s, and he unfortunately passed away earlier this year, in the 1990s and 2000s, he led these high-profile investigations in Congress into how these money laundering operations were working, were developing, and then what it meant for Americans writ large. He, in many ways, was a man kind of ahead of his time in identifying how these networks were developing, and then again, what it meant for the rest of us on the ground. And because of him, we have all these details in how Obiang was operating. In the Kolomoisky case, we have Ukrainian investigations, and we have multiple filings by the Department of Justice showing how Kolomoisky and his network, again, this is all allegedly, we're waiting to see how certain court cases will go, but incredible details into how Kolomoisky was using multiple shell companies, multiple accounts, multiple Americans, and then multiple American states, purchases, jurisdictions to move and hide and launder the money. And I will say, and this is frankly one of the most fascinating details of putting the book together. So we have all the details from that, in addition to conversations I had with others who were involved in these networks, the actual reportage side of it, is that we're talking about, I mean, on the one hand, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars being moved simultaneously, but being moved in such quick fashion and mixing and mashing and swirling all of this illicit wealth together in such a quick function that one of the investigators told me she thinks this wasn't manual. She thinks there was actually machine learning involved. So now we're getting into a whole new realm of artificial intelligence and big data that this one investigator believes was being used not for, again, any public service, not for any kind of pro-democratic values, but to hide the source of all of this illicit Ponzi scheme-based wealth, which is, certainly I believe, and I would argue, is going to be one of the next frontiers of how these networks are operating. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, though, because we do know big data machine learning can be an excellent source for investigating and identifying the actual networks, how they operate, and pulling out patterns that other investigators wouldn't be able to find.
That's exactly right. I think, frankly, machine learning has been used by the kleptocrats, but there's an opportunity for civil society, government to also apply machine learning to study these transactions and flag illicit income, money laundering efforts, or kleptocratic networks putting resources in the U.S. So this one actually comes close to something that I was thinking, but anonymous attendee asks about American oligarchs. What is your suspicion about, could you also provide your definition of oligarch and give an assessment of American oligarchs and U.S. efforts to launder funds overseas?
Yeah, oligarch is, it's funny because I've had these conversations with, other policymakers and other experts in the field over the last, frankly, few months now. And it's one of those kind of slippery terms that you find a little bit different definition all over the place. As I argue, an oligarch is a figure that can be in an official position, but they're generally not, that has gained their wealth through illicit or underhanded or opaque access to, as we call them, rents. So these are, natural resources. These are access to state monopolies, things like railways or ports, again, we see this most especially in things like gas fields, oil extraction, hydrocarbons, mining, et cetera, et cetera. And then being able to access those sorts of funds, those sources of rents, because of close or underhanded or subterfuge-based, whatever term you like to use, relationships with political forces, with autocrats, rising despotic figures, dictators, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is a phenomenon or a typology that we see most especially in the post-Soviet space. So think of, again, countries like Russia or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, or, there's still certain oligarchic figures in Ukraine. And then the question is, if we have that kind of definition, and this is frankly something I don't know that I have a clear and fast answer to. Can we use that typology, that definition, in the US or in Canada or in the UK or in the EU? And I think I would argue that you can. I know there are others that argue against that, but I would say that we have this phenomenon, certainly, of figures in the US, in Canada, in the broader West, that maybe they had initial entrepreneurial or jobs creating or industrial inclinations or desires or effects. But what we have seen is the consolidation of such spectacular wealth that they have gained access to levels of power via that money itself, that they can tilt democratic balance. And again, this is where the intersection of kleptocracy on the one hand and the broader kind of offshoring or financial secrecy world that we see certain wealthy Americans certainly taking advantage of as it pertains to things like tax minimization and, again, the kind of broader offshoring network. We see these kind of elements as two pillars of the broader offshoring world itself. I wouldn't say that, folks like the Sacklers here in the US or Jeff Bezos or maybe even Bill Gates are, kleptocratic figures. I wouldn't ascribe that notion to them, but they increasingly resemble oligarchic figures, especially those incredibly wealthy figures that are as dedicated to upending and bankrolling political forces as we now see in the U.S. But no, that's how I would respond. Alex, what about yourself? Are there and I would say not what about yourself, but how is your definition or understanding, has it changed over the last 6 months, year, 2 years, few years?
I think it has, and I think the tail end of your last answer is closer to where my thinking is. It's ruled by the ultra wealthy, to put it in simple terms.
Yeah.
And I think what you have is you do have the wealthiest Americans, billionaires that have become heavily involved in politics and heavily involved in buying particular political outcomes and building systems to achieve political outcomes. And that to me is where you start slipping into the world of oligarchy. And that's in fact where you might need to start thinking about legislation and a way to really control the use of enormous wealth to affect democracy.
Yeah.
Because there are in fact families in the US that have built over the course of decades, have built conservative movements around certain issues and really position us for the world we see today.
Yeah, right. It's an element of, this is tangential to the conversation right now, but one of the things that we've been seeing in Washington is discussion around financing of and refinancing of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, which has been effectively decimated over the last 15 years. And it's not just the revitalization of the IRS in and of itself to go after, again, these particularly wealthy tax cheats, but it's getting the IRS to where it was under, in this case, previous Republican administrations, such as the Eisenhower administration. When you think back to the 1950s, which in many ways is kind of broader golden era of American economic opportunity. Mm-hmm. What you had then was this magnitude greater funding and bankrolling of the IRS, magnitudes higher elements of certainly taxation for that, the marginal tax rates of the top 10, top 5, top 1 And it's a, again, on the one hand, it's new bankrolling, new funding of things like the IRS. But on the other hand, it's simply a rebalancing to where America was in the 1950s. And then beyond that, recognizing, because we didn't have the shell companies, we didn't have the anonymous private equity investments, hedge funds investments, the kleptocratic tools like that. We didn't have those in the 1950s. So it's also a matter of patching that up to get us back to this kind of status quo ante before things kind of began slowly, decade by decade, falling apart to where we are right now.
I think, Casey, this is American Oligarchy could be your next book or something like that.
Well, that is certainly an opportunity. And unfortunately, there does seem to be more and more material on the topic year in and year out. So I'll keep you updated.
So I think we might have time. We'll see how it goes. We might have time for one or two more questions, but I want to get to Chip Corbett's excellent question. Autocrats rely on money to retain power. Democracies rely on people to defend them. Which group do you think will prevail in the near future? This is kind of our, optimistic or pessimistic question that we were discussing earlier.
I was going to say, I knew what my answer was going to be until we got to those last two words, which Chip mentioned, near future. Because now we're qualifying, what does it actually entail for near future? Is this the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? The short answer to that is near-term pessimist, long-term optimist. That's been one of my kind of operating MOs for the last few years, and is certainly perhaps played out in a far more spectacular fashion than I anticipated. I will say, Alex, what you were talking about earlier, the next 3, 4, 5 years I think it's very fair for any of us to expect certainly rocky roads ahead within that, whether it's economically, whether it's politically, whether it's in terms of the broader national security components. I think the 2020s are going to be, in the broader scope and broader sweep of American history, one of the more tumultuous ones. And certainly one that will require as much civic engagement and as much expertise to get us through this. And I do expect us to get through this. And I do expect on the far side of this decade or the next 5 years, us to be stronger, better positioned, and more well off than we are right now. Alex, to say nothing of figures like you, Americans like you, who step forward when they are called, who step forward when the right step is required. Because Americans will do that. Not everyone, okay, fine. There are certain figures that certainly won't. But in the broad scope, in the broad sweep, in the broader story of America, what we see time and again are specific figures and specific forces stepping forward to redirect this country on the proper route. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen year in, year out. But if you look at the 10,000-foot view of American history, that is the trajectory. That was probably a convoluted response to that question. Alex, what about you? Where do you stand?
So I think we're going to have a struggle in the short term, 3 to 5 years, definitely. And probably longer, frankly. This might be a generational struggle, and the reason is that it's a systems competition of sorts between authoritarianism and the tools that enable authoritarianism, including kleptocracy and oligarchy and money laundering, and democracy and human rights, civil liberties, protection of property, and things of that nature. And what you have now is, you don't just have a resurgence of authoritarianism. You also have a surge in authoritarian networks and kleptocracy. And with the behemoth of China backing some of these, what you end up with is really a second financial structure. So you have the international system undergirded by kind of basic principles, transparency. But you also have the international system that's going to be undergirded by authoritarianism and kleptocracy. And when the U.S. chooses to apply its powerful economic arm of sanctions, what you could have is financial transactions occur in this separate system, and that's probably what we're going to have to deal with. So until we get China to play by the rules and Russia to play by the rules, we're going to have a proliferation, I think, of kleptocracy and money laundering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that you networks and that this systematized approach. There's a wonderful article in the Atlantic magazine by a writer named Ann Applebaum maybe a week or two ago, using that exact same terminology, examining this kind of autocracy Inc. of all these autocratic figures using the same networks, using the same tools, using the same dynamics. The benefit of that being that because they're all using similar mechanisms, similar tools, similar tactics, we can put forth policy proposals and we can identify the specific inflection points of how these autocratic, dictatorial, kleptocratic figures operate. Because again, this is, and maybe this is one of the themes in my book. Certainly, I would argue one of the themes in your book, Alex, as well, is that these corrupt networks, because that's really what they are. We're talking about large-scale, grand corruption that allows these figures to rise to power domestically in their countries. That corruption, it doesn't remain over there. We're no longer in a world where corruption remains in one country, one jurisdiction. It spreads, it metastasizes, and all too often it does so using American systems and American networks that we have been blind to, willingly or otherwise, for years and years. And we're only just seeing what the cost of that is going to comprise. But yes, I would just echo everything you just said about the kind of strategic competition we're now facing between democracy, rule of people, on the one hand, and this kind of autocratic, kleptocratic, dictatorial networking that we see on the other hand. We're only just beginning on this journey. I am ultimately optimistic that democracy will prevail because humans, at the end of the day, they want dignity, and dignity stems from democracy. We certainly saw that play out in Ukraine 7, 8 years ago, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of that. But that's absolutely one of the reasons I'm optimistic.
Well, if you haven't yet purchased Casey Michel's American Kleptocracy, go ahead and do so. It's a very informative read. It's not just facts and data, it's also narrative, some interesting stories about Michael Jackson's gloves and money flowing into middle America and so forth. So I encourage you to go out and buy this book.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. I will say I would obviously encourage folks to buy Alex's book as well. I know we didn't talk about the first impeachment trial of former President Trump. When I was writing the book, I thought that was going to be the only impeachment trial. Well, little did I know. But phenomenal story. If you want any, okay, maybe hopefully I'm not blowing too much hot air, but I will say if you want any restoration in the faith of what America is and is capable of, read Alex's book. You won't help but come out of it, again, optimistic about where things can go. We try everything once, or we try all the wrong things once, we realize they're wrong, and we eventually end up on the right road. And I do think that is absolutely where things are heading, both in terms of the policy and the personnel space. And
yeah, just one point. I guess this is a series of questions. What can we do? I would say that, frankly, both of us try to illustrate that, you have individuals that are trying to do the right thing, and in my case, really one person, in the right location with the proper kind of capabilities can really make a difference.
Yeah, and it's even as simple as talking to, maybe you have friends who work in real estate. Maybe you have friends who work in the, luxury goods sector. Maybe you have friends who work in the private equity or hedge funds market. I mean, I have plenty of friends who work in all those industries. It may even be as simple as a conversation asking about anti-money. I mean, maybe it's not the sexiest topic for, a beer, but talking about dirty money, illicit wealth, money laundering, kleptocracy. Maybe even just bringing that up, because there are wonderful people that work in all those sectors that know they have to clean it up, but they are facing a lobbying structure. They're facing deep pockets that oppose those reforms. So building those allies and those alliances with those that work in these industries that want to clean them up is an absolute must as well.
There it is, American Kleptocracy. Thanks so much, Casey. Thanks, Alex, for joining us too. Here's Alex's book right here too. I just put in the chat a link to Casey's book. It comes out officially tomorrow. You can click on that link and order your copy. You can see that we have autographed copies because Casey came by our warehouse and signed a bunch of them. So order that up there. I'm also going to put in the chat a link to our YouTube channel, and you can check out all of our past events, all of our past Zoom events there. And this event will probably be going up there sometime tomorrow afternoon. If you have friends that missed it and want to share it with other people, feel free to check back there, and you can share the event there. Alex, Casey, it was so great to listen to you talk about this important book. Thanks everyone at home for viewing, and have a great night.
Thanks, Kevin. And if anyone still wants to buy a copy, please buy from Powell's for this book, any book you're purchasing.
Thank you.